Hello there. In life, no one can predict the unexpected. Hardships can strike suddenly, taking away the peace we once knew. But it is in these moments that a person's true strength is revealed. The story of Barbara Maybe Abel is a testament to the extraordinary power of family love. Barbara and Beverly were twin sisters, identical like two drops of water. But from a young age, Beverly faced severe health issues due to cerebral palsy. Throughout her life, Barbara affectionately called her sister Bevy. Their bond was so strong that a single glance was enough to understand each other's thoughts. Since childhood, Barbara devoted herself to ensuring Bevy had a full and happy life. After their father passed away, she took care of their mother and managed the household. In April 1968, after bringing her newborn son Dale home from the hospital and finalizing her divorce, Barbara decided to raise him at her mother's house, a decision she never regretted. Their family lived happily together, but in May 1974, tragedy struck when their mother passed away. Barbara and Beverly grieved deeply, but they tried to keep the house filled with warmth and laughter. On the morning of Thursday, November 14, 1974, their day began like any other. Barbara prepared for work, Dale got ready for school, and Beverly enjoyed her breakfast. After dropping Dale off, Barbara drove to the radio station where she worked as an editor. Near midday, she called home multiple times, but Beverly didn't answer, an unusual occurrence since Bevy always picked up. At first, Barbara brushed it off and continued her work. After finishing her shift, Barbara drove home with her son. As soon as she stepped inside, she called out for Beverly but received no response. She told Dale, "Go find Aunt Bevy while I get you some water." As Dale ran around the house searching for his aunt, Barbara went to the kitchen. Suddenly, an eerie chill ran down her spine. Turning instinctively, she was met with a horrifying sight, a man pointing a gun directly at her. At that moment, Dale ran into the kitchen, panicked. "Mom, Aunt Bevy is in her room, but there's a lot of blood." Barbara clutched her son tightly, shielding him from the stranger. The man, armed and dangerous, forced them into the bedroom. Inside, Barbara found Beverly curled up under a blanket, her mouth gagged with a piece of cloth. Rushing to her, Barbara gently removed the gag, hugged her, and kissed her forehead. "We're going to be okay, I promise," she whispered, trying to comfort her sister. But when she pulled the blanket down, horror consumed her. Beverly was unclothed. Overcome with rage, Barbara turned to the man and screamed, "Did you rape her? If you did, I swear I'll kill you." The man smirked and admitted that he had tried but failed. A wave of fear overtook Barbara as she imagined the suffering Beverly had endured. Desperate to protect her family, Barbara composed herself and offered him all the money she had, including her car keys, in exchange for their safety. But the man had another demand. He wanted to take her son. Without hesitation, Barbara volunteered to go in Dale's place. After a tense moment, the man agreed to her proposal. He introduced himself as Paul John Knowles, a fugitive who had escaped prison and vowed never to return. But Barbara, still reeling from what had happened to Beverly, didn't believe a word he said. Her only concern was keeping her son safe. Before leaving, Knowles tied Dale to the bed alongside his aunt. Barbara's heart ached at the thought of leaving her family helpless and bound. But she had no choice. As she was forced out the door, she turned to Dale and said, "Be brave, sweetheart. I will come back." With that, Knowles grabbed the car keys and money, pressed the gun against her back, and led her outside. Inside the vehicle, Barbara's mind raced with worry for her son and sister, unaware that she was now in grave danger herself. Meanwhile, just a few miles from Barbara's home, police discovered an abandoned car belonging to a man named William Bates. He had been carjacked in September, and months later, his body was found in Ohio, strangled to death. Inside the car, investigators found credit cards and insurance papers belonging to Carswell Carr, a man who had been murdered along with his 15-year-old daughter Amanda in Georgia just days before Barbara's abduction. The Carr family's home had been ransacked on November 6, 1974, nearly 500 miles from Barbara's residence. Amanda had been strangled, while her father was stabbed approximately 35 times. Inside the stolen vehicle, investigators also discovered a will signed by a man named Paul John Knowles. What they didn't realize was that Knowles was a serial killer, roaming the country and leaving bodies in his wake. In just 5 months, over 30 people had been murdered, possibly even more. Police warned that anyone could be a target: men, women, children. If he wanted to kill, nothing would stop him. As law enforcement scrambled to catch him, they had no idea that Paul John Knowles was already on the road with his next victim. Back in the car with Barbara, the radio suddenly aired a breaking news report about a murder. Instantly agitated, Knowles ordered her to change the station. Before she could question him, he casually admitted, "I killed that person." His confession, spoken as lightly as a passing remark, sent a chill down Barbara's spine. Realizing she needed to distract him, she engaged him in conversation. They talked about the weather, movies, and the greatest songs of the 70s. Then an idea sparked in her mind. She would make him fall for her, soothing his erratic behavior and buying herself time to escape. Turning to him with a soft voice, she asked, "Darling, would you like a cigarette?" Her sudden shift in tone startled him. "Why did you call me darling?" he asked suspiciously. Barbara simply smiled and replied, "Why not? You're not so bad. You even look a little like Robert Redford." Her words took him by surprise, momentarily throwing him off guard. As they continued talking, Knowles opened up about his twisted thoughts. When he learned that Barbara was a radio editor and could write, he confided that he wanted to be famous for killing. Hearing his confession over and over, Barbara felt a deep sense of terror. Every instinct screamed at her to jump out of the car and run, but she knew she had to suppress her fear and remain composed. Back at home, Dale, Barbara's son, had been struggling against his restraints. After 30 agonizing minutes, he finally managed to free himself and untie his aunt. Without hesitation, he ran to the neighbor's house, frantically pounding on the door. His body was covered in blood, his wrists and ankles bruised from the tight ropes. Between sobs, he cried out, "My mom! She's been kidnapped!" When the police arrived, they feared the worst. The details they gathered painted a chilling portrait of Paul John Knowles. He was constantly on the move, using different vehicles, with mismatched license plates, leaving behind credit card receipts and scattered identities. Law enforcement knew enough about him to be terrified that Barbara's chances of survival were slim. Without wasting time, the police immediately set up roadblocks and expanded their search across the region. All eyes were on Barbara's yellow Volkswagen. However, the problem was that Paul John Knowles had already taken Barbara far from the area. After driving nearly 70 miles north along Florida's A1A highway, the two stopped at a motel in Fort Pierce. When the car halted, Barbara pleaded with him to let her go, but he coldly pressed the gun against her back and said, "No, you're coming with me." Fear washed over Barbara, but she knew she had to stay calm to avoid provoking him. They posed as a married couple to rent a room. At the front desk, Knowles placed his hand on Barbara's hip, his gun hidden beneath his shirt. Sensing the receptionist's suspicion, Barbara quickly wrapped her arm around Knowles and pulled him closer. Eventually, they were given the key to room 10. As soon as they entered, Knowles ordered Barbara to undress, but she firmly resisted. His anger erupted, transforming him into a violent and uncontrollable beast. For a moment, Barbara truly believed he would kill her. In desperation, she weakly asked, "What are you doing?" Paul suddenly paused, shook his head, and muttered, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Paul John Knowles was completely unpredictable. One moment he was calm, the next he was a raging monster. Barbara felt utterly powerless, unsure if she would survive the night. He then tore the blanket into strips and tied her wrists and ankles to the bed frame. Terrified, Barbara silently prayed for a miracle. Exhausted both physically and mentally, she eventually drifted into sleep. In her dreams, Barbara saw her mother, who appeared tenderly and reassured her, "Everything will be okay." The vision gave her strength. She woke to the sound of a television. Paul sat beside her, eyes fixated on the screen. When she looked up, she saw their faces on the news. The reports of his horrifying crimes made her panic, but she also realized something. The fact that her kidnapping was on television meant her sister and son were safe. That thought brought her a small sense of relief. By November 15th, Barbara had been missing for over 18 hours, yet the police had found no trace of her. A nationwide manhunt for Paul John Knowles was launched, spreading news of a serial killer kidnapping a woman in Florida. As for Barbara and Knowles, when he woke up, he untied her and took her to a small restaurant nearby. Seated at the table, Barbara discreetly scanned the surroundings, hoping to find a chance to escape. However, she quickly noticed Knowles had his gun hidden beneath his coat. She silently prayed that someone had seen her face on the news and would recognize her, but to her dismay, no one did. After breakfast, Knowles drove Barbara back to the motel and again attempted to assault her, but once again he failed. His frustration grew. Barbara was terrified. She felt that as long as she was with him, she could be killed at any moment. She tried to soothe him, and surprisingly, after calming down, Knowles sighed and said, "I wish I had met you before all of this happened." The defining moment. A while later, he tied her back to the bed, saying he needed to step out to make a phone call. As soon as the door shut behind him, Barbara struggled with all her strength to free herself. While trying to escape, she spotted the room key on the bedside table. This meant Paul had locked himself out. He couldn't get back in, unless she opened the door for him. If he called for hotel staff, it would expose him. Paul John Knowles wrestled with the door handle. A mix of excitement and fear surged through Barbara. She remained silent, waiting. The handle rattled continuously, before suddenly going still. A few moments later, she heard Knowles whisper through the door, "When they take you away, don't tell them I hurt you. I love you." Then silence. He was probably planning something insane. Barbara was too afraid to scream for help, fearing he might still be standing outside. At 7:30 a.m. on November 16th, after a long wait, she finally picked up the phone and called the front desk, identifying herself as Barbara Maybe and reporting that she had been kidnapped by a serial killer. Within minutes, police arrived and escorted her out of the room. At the front desk, Barbara received a phone call from her sister, Beverly. They tearfully exchanged words of relief, grateful that both were safe. After hanging up, Barbara sobbed uncontrollably for 15 minutes. Even after reuniting with her family, she remained haunted by the fear that Paul John Knowles was still out there. She was terrified that one day he would return to her home and continue what he had started. The end of a serial killer. Paul's crimes began unraveling on November 16, 1974, when State Trooper Charles Campbell pulled him over for a routine check. Recognizing Barbara's stolen Volkswagen, the officer attempted to arrest him, but Knowles fought back. He managed to snatch the trooper's gun, took him hostage, and forced him into the patrol car before speeding away. Shortly after, he used the police siren to pull over a car driven by James Meyer, a 29-year-old man. He took both Meyer and the officer hostage, forcing them into Meyer's vehicle. Barbara's yellow Volkswagen was left behind, while the police officer and his patrol car vanished. A police abduction had never happened before, and the news spread across the country like wildfire. Eventually, Campbell's patrol car was found, abandoned by the roadside. In Lakeland, Georgia, 80 miles from where the officer was kidnapped, a gas station attendant alerted police after seeing a suspicious scene. A man in civilian clothes and a state trooper sat in the back seat of a car with another man driving. The police immediately began pursuit. They set up a roadblock ahead, forcing Knowles to crash into the barricade. He then abandoned the car and ran into the woods. The chaotic foot chase involved officers, K-9 units, and helicopters. Just when it seemed like they had him cornered, he managed to escape. However, he had been shot in the leg during the chase. Wounded, he was eventually spotted by a hunter who managed to subdue him until authorities arrived and placed him under arrest. Although Paul John Knowles was finally captured, police were horrified to discover that neither of the two hostages were in the crashed car. Knowles refused to reveal their whereabouts. This news was a massive relief for Barbara and her family. But deep down, she knew that the man who had kidnapped and held her captive for over 36 hours had previously escaped from prison. She still did not feel safe. What Barbara truly wanted was for Paul John Knowles to no longer exist. Even after the ordeal, Barbara struggled with painful memories. There were times when she would suddenly break down, screaming and crying uncontrollably. She knew she needed professional help, but more than anything, she longed to share her emotions with someone who would understand. A year before the incident, Barbara had met Jim. However, due to his work requiring him to travel abroad, they maintained their connection through letters. Over time, their feelings for each other grew. A few months after the kidnapping, Barbara decided to write to Jim and tell him everything. When Jim learned about the horrors she had endured, he made a firm decision. He would be the one to help her overcome her trauma. Perhaps fate had heard her prayers. On December 18, 1974, more than a month after the kidnapping, Paul agreed to lead the police to the location where he had hidden the weapon used to kill Officer Charles Eugene Campbell and James Meyer. Sheriff Earl Lee and Special Agent Ronnie, Angel from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, escorted Paul. He was handcuffed and placed in a vehicle to direct the officers to the gun he had discarded after murdering the two men on November 16th. While driving down the highway, Paul used a paperclip to unlock his handcuffs, seized Lee's revolver, and attempted to fire through the holster. As Lee struggled with Paul to regain control of the vehicle, Ronnie fired 3 shots into Paul's chest, killing him instantly. Upon hearing the news, Dale, Beverly, and Barbara were overwhelmed with relief, knowing that their greatest fear had finally been eliminated. They were ready to embark on a new chapter of their lives. Barbara recalled moments when she had wanted to give up, but she realized that this was her life. She was living in her mother's home, a place filled with love. This house carried more beautiful memories than painful ones. With that in mind, she chose to stay and rebuild her life, for Beverly, for Dale, and for herself. She shared, "Every day of life, every moment of existence is precious. We can only discover its true value when we learn to cherish each moment, overcome hardships, and keep moving forward on our journey."